You want to know what I remember most about the war? It ain't the big battles you read about in the papers. Oh, they were loud enough, sure, a hellish symphony of artillery and screaming metal that make your teeth rattle. But when I close my eyes, it's the small things that come back to me first. The weight of a cigarette ration in my breast pocket, right over my heart. The feel of a worn photograph, its edges gone soft from being handled 1,000 times. That's where we really lived, you see, in those tiny spaces between the fear. We were just kids trying to hold on to our humanity with both hands, and the only tools we had were the little things we carried. My pockets were never just for ammunition. They were a museum of my other life, the one I was desperate to get back to. There was the St. Christopher medal my mother pressed into my palm the day I shipped out, cold against my skin at first, but always warm by the end of the day. There was the little notebook, a small black thing I'd swiped from a supply clerk, where I tried to write down the good moments, the funny things the guys said, the taste of a hot meal, anything so I wouldn't forget that a world existed outside the mud and the misery. But the most important thing, the thing I touched every single morning like a prayer, was the photograph of my family. It was taken on our front porch back in Ohio, my mom smiling that worried smile she always had, my dad with his hand on my shoulder, proud as punch, and my kid sister grinning like a fool. The paper was creased and starting to fade from being exposed to the elements, but I'd traced their faces with my thumb before we moved out, a silent ritual for luck. It was a stupid superstition, maybe, but in a place where death was as random as a stray shell, you clung to anything that felt like a charm. That small, physical connection to home was a tether, and if I held on tight enough, I believed it might just pull me all the way back. And in that world, a new economy sprang up, an economy of survival where the currency wasn't dollars and cents but comfort. A piece of chocolate from a creche was more valuable than a month's pay. It wasn't food, not really. It was a memory, a 5-second vacation. You'd let it melt on your tongue, and for a fleeting moment, you weren't in some godforsaken French field. You were a kid again, sitting on the stoop on a summer evening. And cigarettes were the gold standard. They were a clock, a calendar, a shared ritual. A smoke after a firefight was like drawing a line under the terror, a way to say that pot was over for now. We trade them for everything. A can of peaches, a dry pair of socks, a few extra minutes of watch relief. I saw a guy trade his last cigarette for a single sheet of writing paper because he said he had to get a letter home to his girl, that the words couldn't wait. That was the unspoken barter system among us, a delicate web of trades based on what we needed to get through the next hour, the next day. But the most profound feeling, the one that could almost make you forget the war for a full 10 seconds, was a warm cup of coffee. Not the usual sludge we boiled in our helmets, but real hot coffee, if we were lucky enough to get it from a field kitchen. The smell alone was a physical thing, wrapping around you like a blanket. You decradle the tin cup in both hands, letting the heat seep into your frozen fingers, and you just breathe it in before you ever took a sip. In that steam, you could see 1,000 ordinary mornings, a kitchen table, a newspaper, a wife humming softly. It was the ghost of a normal life, and we drank it down like medicine. Those little rituals were what held us together, what kept us from unraveling, like mail call. You've never seen a group of hardened men turn into such anxious boys as when the male sergeant showed up. The whole world would just fall silent. You'd hear your own heart pounding in your ears as he called out the names, each one a lottery winner. Johnson, Rixey, O'Malley. And if you heard your name, a wave of relief would wash over you so powerful your knees would go weak. It wasn't just paper. It was a voice from across the ocean, a tangible piece of love. You take that letter and find a quiet spot, if such a thing existed, and you'd read it slowly, savoring every word, every loop of your mother's handwriting, every silly doodle from your little brother. Then you'd read it again, and again, until the paper was soft and the words were memorized. Other rituals were born right there in the dirt. Sharing a single cigarette with 2 other guys, passing it around, each man taking 2 or 3 deep, grateful drags, the glow lighting up the weary faces in the dark. There was a communion in that, or cleaning my rifle. It was a practical task. Sure, your life depended on a clean weapon, but it was also a form of meditation. In the methodical stripping down, the brushing, the oiling, the reassembly, you could focus your mind and steady your hands. For those 10 minutes, Your world shrank down to the cold metal and wood in your lap, and the chaos outside faded to a dull roar. It was a way to impose order on the madness. You learn a lot about people when everything else is stripped away. You see their true character. I remember one time, we were holed up in what was left of a barn, the cold so deep it felt like it was in your bones. We'd been on the move for days, living on cold rations and nerves. One of the guys, a big fella from Brooklyn named Mike, found a can of stew buried at the bottom of his pack. His eyes lit up like he'd found Fort Knox. He could have eaten it all himself, and no one would have blamed him. But he didn't. He got out his mess kit, and with a solemnity you'd usually reserve for church, he went around and doled out a spoonful to each of us. It wasn't enough to fill you up, not even close, but that single, warm spoonful tasted better than any steak dinner I'd ever had. It was a gesture that said, "We're in this together. We'll get through this together." That's the legacy of those small things you see. The memory of that shared meal, of Mike's grimy face smiling as he passed out that stew, feels more significant to me now than any battle map or strategic objective. It was in those moments that we realized what we were really fighting for. It wasn't for some grand idea of freedom, not in the heat of the moment anyway. It was for the right to go back to those small, ordinary moments. It was for the chance to sit at a kitchen table again, to feel the sun on your face without wondering if a sniper was watching, to share a meal with people you love without counting the spoonfuls. That understanding hit me hardest in the spring of '45, after the fighting had died down and we were overseeing a temporary POW camp. War in Europe was winding down, and the place was full of weary, defeated German soldiers. They were just boys like us, hollowed out by the same war. My job was to help guard the perimeter. It was a strange, quiet time after all the noise. One afternoon, I was leaning against a jeep, trying to scrape the mud off my boots, when I saw one of the German prisoners, a kid who couldn't have been more than 18, sitting by himself against the fence. He had that 1,000-yard stare we all knew too well. He was shivering and he looked empty. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was because he reminded me of my kid brother. Maybe I was just tired of hating. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my last piece of army bread, hard as a rock, and my last cigarette. I walked over to the fence. He flinched when he saw me, expecting trouble, I guess. I just held them out through the wire. For a long moment he just stared, not understanding. Then, slowly, he reached out and took them. He didn't devour the bread like I thought he would. He broke it in two and offered half back to me. I shook my head. Then he did something I'll never forget. He took the cigarette, placed it between his cracked lips, and lit it with a shaking hand. He took one deep, grateful drag, and then he passed it back to me through the same fence. I took it, and I smoked it. We didn't speak a word. We didn't need to. There we were, two enemies, sharing a cigarette through a fence, understanding that down deep, beneath the uniforms and the flags and the propaganda, we were just a couple of hungry, scared kids who missed our homes. In that tiny act, that simple sharing of a smoke, all the hatred and the grand causes fell away. That's where our humanity was preserved, not in the grand gestures of generals and politicians, but in these small, quiet acts of decency between broken men. That's the weight I carry with me now, all these years later. Not the weight of the rifle or the pack or the fear, but the weight of a piece of bread, the shared warmth of a cigarette, and the enduring memory of a simple kindness that proved, even in the heart of hell, that our shared humanity could still flicker, like a small, stubborn flame in the wind. You want to know about the war, not the maps and the arrows, the generals and the speeches. You want to know what it was like. It was the cold. It was a cold that got into your bones and decided to live there, a permanent tenant that paid no rent. It was the smell, God, the smell, a thick stew of cordite and brick dust, rotting flesh and shit, and always, underneath it all, the sour tang of fear. Stalingrad wasn't a city anymore. It was a skeleton picked clean by rats and madmen, and we were the maggots crawling around in its ribcage. We didn't fight for streets or squares. We fought for rooms. A single room in a shattered apartment building could cost a dozen men. And the Germans, the Fritzes, they were never more than a wall away. You'd be huddled in what was left of a kitchen, the floral wallpaper all scorched and peeling, and you could hear them on the other side of that same wall, coughing, talking in their low, guttural tongue. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the shooting stopped for a few blessed minutes, you'd hear one of them sing. It was always some sad, slow folk tune, and in the darkness, it didn't sound so different from the songs we sang back home. That was the worst part, I think, hearing that humanity. It was easier when they were just shapes in a gun sight, devils in fieldgray. But a man singing a lonely song to himself, that was a different kind of weapon, one that got past all your defenses. I remember one time, early on, maybe November 42. The fighting had been hell all day, a seesaw battle for a bombed-out tractor factory. By evening, a strange quiet fell. Not peace, never peace, just a temporary exhaustion. The air was thick with dust motes dancing in the low red sun. I was leaning against a broken lathe, my rifle slick in my hands, just trying to catch my breath that came out in ragged white puffs. Across the courtyard, through a gaping hole where a wall used to be, I saw him. A German soldier, his uniform as filthy as mine, his face a mask of grime and stubble. He was leaning against his side of the wall, just as spent as I was. Our eyes met across that 50 yards of rubble, and we just looked. He made no move for his rifle. I made no move for mine. It was like we were two boxers in the 10th round, too damn tired to throw another punch. We just stood there, acknowledging the other's existence, two stray dogs in a junkyard. Then a shell screamed in the distance, and the spell broke. He ducked back into his shadow, and I into mine. But that moment stuck with me. It was the first crack. You get to know a man by the sounds he makes, even if he's your enemy. After a while, you learned their routines. You knew which one had the raspy smoker's cough that would start up just before dawn. You knew which unit had a guy who could actually play a harmonica, and sometimes he'd play a tune that was almost cheerful, and for a second, you forget where you were. And you knew they could hear us too. They heard Ivan, one of the older guys in my squad, who was always complaining about his bad knee, always muttering about the blasted cold. They heard our dark, stupid jokes, the kind of humor that only makes sense when death is sitting next to you sharing a cigarette. There was an intimacy to it, a terrible, unwanted intimacy. We knew each other better than we knew the replacements who showed up fresh-faced and scared, only to be gone a day later. The real enemy, see, wasn't always the man across the courtyard. The real enemy was the artillery. When the barrage started, the world ended. The sky would just fall to pieces. The ground shook like a mad thing, and the noise. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a physical force that punched you in the chest and rattled your teeth. In those moments, there were no Russians, no Germans. There were just men, curled up in holes, praying to whatever god they remembered from childhood, all equally small and helpless under that steel rain. We were all in it together against the impersonal meat grinder of high explosives. Then came the morning it all changed. It was so cold the air felt like shards of glass in your lungs. A clean, brutal cold that made the previous days feel almost mild. The fighting had been static for 48 hours, a frozen stalemate. We were out of water. The pumps were broken. The Volga was a dangerous trek away, and sucking on dirty snow just made you thirstier. But this morning, after a quiet night, a fresh, clean blanket of snow had fallen, covering the worst of the filth. I saw my chance. I clambered out of our cellar, my breath pluming, my mittened hands scrabbling on the frozen bricks. And as I straightened up, there he was, maybe 20 feet away, a German guard standing sentry by a makeshift bunker. He was younger than me, I think, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, his greatcoat hanging off him like a sack. He saw me at the same instant. We both froze. My hand went to the knife on my belt, a useless gesture. His hand twitched toward the rifle slung on his shoulder, but neither of us moved. Our eyes locked, and in his eyes I didn't see hate. I didn't see the fanatical Nazi we were told about. I saw the same exhaustion, the same deep, soul-crushing weariness that I felt in my own bones. I saw a boy, a long way from home, just as scared and cold and hungry as I was. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I nodded back. It was just a tiny thing, a flicker, but in that moment the whole damned ideology, the propaganda, the hatred they drilled into us, it just evaporated. It was just him and me, two survivors in a world of ruin. I felt a hot wave of shame, shame that I couldn't muster the hate I was supposed to feel, and then a greater wave of relief. The burden of hating him was just too heavy to carry anymore. I bent down, scooped up a handful of clean snow, packed it into my mouth, and slipped back into my hole. He did the same. A few days later, it was all over for me. A patrol, a stupid, chaotic ambush in the ruins of a department store. A concussion grenade went off too close, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground, ears ringing, with a couple of lancers staring down at me, their rifle barrels looking as big as train tunnels. I was a prisoner. They marched me, stumbling, back to a temporary holding area near the train yard, a cratered building surrounded by a makeshift fence of barbed wire and despair. There were a handful of other prisoners there, all of us sharing that 1,000-yard stare. We were the living dead. The guard assigned to us was the same boy from the snow. I recognized him instantly. He looked even worse now, if that was possible. His face was grey, and he had a nervous tick under his eye. He'd pace back and forth, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, trying to look stern, but his shoulders were slumped. He was just a kid playing a role. We'd been there a day, maybe two. Time had lost all meaning. The Germans weren't feeding us much, and they weren't feeding their own guards much better. Rations were a joke. I had one last piece of black bread left, a hard, stale crust I'd been saving in my pocket, nursing it like a treasure. It was my last connection to life, to tomorrow. I saw the guard stumble slightly as he walked, catching himself on a pile of rubble. He was starving. I could see it in the way his hands shook. He wasn't my enemy anymore. He was just a starving boy. Something in me broke, or maybe something in me finally fixed itself. I didn't think. It was an impulse, straight from the gut. I stood up slowly, my hands open. He flinched, raising his rifle, his eyes wide with fear. I reached into my pocket, pulled out that last piece of bread and held it out to him. My hand was trembling, but not from fear, from the sheer madness of the act. He stared at the bread, then at my face, then back at the bread. The confusion in his eyes was total. This wasn't in the rulebook. This wasn't how the war was supposed to go. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His eyes never left mine. He slowly lowered his rifle and reached out. His fingers, bare and blue with cold, brushed against my mittened hand as he took the crust. He didn't devour it. He just held it, looking at it as if it were the most miraculous thing he'd ever seen. Then he looked back at me, and his face, it crumpled. It wasn't the look of a victor. It was a look of profound, shared defeat, of understanding. He gave that same small nod from the courtyard. A single tear cut a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He whispered something I didn't understand. Dank kamerad. Then he turned and walked away, clutching that piece of bread like a holy relic. They transferred me to another camp the next day. I never saw him again. I survived the camps by some miracle. I came home, but I've never forgotten that boy's face. They told us we were fighting monsters. But in the deepest hell men can create, I learned that the most powerful weapon isn't a bullet or a bomb. It's a flicker of humanity. It's a shared piece of bread between two lost boys, a silent truce in the ruins. That's the only victory that ever meant a damn thing. They gave me a bag full of bandages and a needle and thread instead of a rifle. And at first, I felt like a fool, like a man walking into a hurricane with nothing but a raincoat. All the other fellas, my buddies from basic, they had their M1s. They could fight back. They could make the other guy hurt before he hurt them. Me. All I could do was try to patch up what was left after the hurt was done. It felt like being powerless. But then the first mortar round hit our column outside a little French village whose name I've long forgotten, and the screaming started, and all of a sudden, that bag in my hand felt heavier than any rifle ever could. That red cross on my arm, it was a strange thing. In one way it made me a target, a clear mark for any sniper with a shred of dishonor. But in another, it was the only beacon of hope in a whole world of hell. Men would see it and their eyes would change. Just for a second, the terror would soften into something else, something raw and pleading. I made a promise to myself, right there in the mud and the chaos of that first real engagement. I swore I wouldn't see a uniform first. I wouldn't see American or German. I'd see a wound, a man, a piece of broken humanity that needed fixing. It was a naive promise, maybe, the kind a kid makes before he really knows the cost, but I clung to it like a prayer. You never forget the sound of a man calling medic. It's a sound that cuts through everything. The roar of artillery, the staccato of machine guns, the whistle of incoming shells, it all just becomes noise, a terrible symphony of destruction. But that one word, screamed or whimpered, it slices right through it all and hooks into your soul. You feel it in your bones, a physical pull. I remember one time, it was in the Hoochen forest, a place so dark and dank it felt like we were fighting in a grave. The trees were shattered, just splintered trunks everywhere, and the air was thick with the smell of pine sap and cordite and wet earth. The fighting had been going on for hours, a brutal, close-quarters nightmare. Then I heard it. Medic. For God's sake, medic. Coming from a shell crater about 50 yards ahead, through a hail of German MG-42 fire, that thing they called a buzzsaw because of the rate of fire, a sound that still makes me flinch. My legs felt like lead, my heart was hammering against my ribs like it wanted out, and every instinct told me to press myself deeper into the cold mud. But that voice, it was Jimmy, a kid from Toledo who always talked about his mom's apple pie. So I crawled. I dragged myself on my stomach, my face in the mud, feeling the ground erupt around me as mortars walked their deadly line. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed over my back, and I could taste the metallic tang of fear, sour in my mouth. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy answering a call, driven by a debt I didn't even know I owed until I got over there. When I slid into that crater, the scene was bad. Jimmy was hit in the leg, a real mess. The femoral artery was nicked and blood was pumping out with every beat of his heart. His face was white as a sheet. The other fella in the crater was already gone, his sightless eyes staring up at the leaden sky. My hands, they just started moving. It was like they had a mind of their own. Tourniquet, sulfur powder, trying to find the source of the bleeding in that gory mess, while bullets snapped past overhead, buzzing like angry hornets. It was frantic, desperate work, my fingers slippery with blood, trying to stop what the war had started. You're not thinking, not really, you're just doing. Your training takes over, a strange, calm automaton in the middle of the storm. I got the bleeding slowed, got a pressure bandage on, and gave him a shot of morphine. His breathing eased, and he looked at me, and he whispered, "Thanks, Doc." In that moment, the buzzsaw and the artillery faded away. There was just me and him, and the simple, impossible task of keeping a light from going out. That's what it was, every time. Just trying to keep one more light from going out in all that damned darkness. And the faces, Lord, the faces are what stay with you long after the sounds of the guns have faded. They're burned onto the back of my eyelids. I remember after we finally took a patch of woods, we were mopping up, and we found a German soldier in a foxhole, left behind by his retreating unit. Couldn't have been more than 17, a boy with blonde hair and wide, terrified blue eyes. He was shot through the gut, a bad wound, the kind that usually means a slow, painful end. He was crying not even from the pain, I don't think, but from sheer terror. He was mumbling mutter bit main mutter, over and over. Please, my mother. He had a picture clutched in his hand, a faded photo of a woman with a kind face. And I looked at him, and I didn't see a Nazi, I didn't see the enemy. I saw my kid brother, Charlie, back in Illinois. I saw the same scared boy who used to climb into my bed during a thunderstorm. My buddies were standing around, angry, hardened by the day's fighting, and one of them spat and said, "Let the bastard bleed out." But I couldn't. I just couldn't. I knelt down and started working. I gave him some of my water, tried to make him comfortable, used the last of my sulfur powder. There was nothing I could really do for a wound like that, not out there, but I had to try. He stopped crying as the morphine took hold, and he just looked at me, and in his eyes there was no hate, no ideology, just a profound, simple gratitude. He died about 20 minutes later, holding my hand, looking at a picture of his mother. I sat with him until he was gone. That was harder, in a way, than watching my friends die. With my friends, there was a shared purpose, a bond. With him, it was just a stark, horrible reminder that on both sides of the line, we were all just boys a long way from home, sent to kill each other for reasons that felt very, very small when you were sitting in the mud holding a stranger's hand. Then there was Mike. Mike was my buddy from the very first day of training. We shipped over together, promised each other we'd watch the others back. He was a big, loud Irishman from Boston with a laugh that could lift your spirits even on the worst day. A sniper got him, a single, clean shot through the chest. I got to him fast, but one look and I knew. My training, all my knowledge, it was useless. It was like bringing a spoon to try and bail out the ocean. The hole was small, but I knew what it meant inside. He was drowning in his own blood. I ripped open his tunic, trying to find something, anything to do, but there was nothing. Just that little hole, so innocent-looking, and the blood bubbling at his lips. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. He couldn't talk, but his eyes were locked on mine, wide with the shock of it, with the understanding. And I saw it, the light, the life just draining out of him. I held his hand and I talked to him. I talked about Boston, about the girls we'd meet when we got home, about stupid, meaningless things we'd done back in basic. I watched his eyes until they went blank, fixed on a point somewhere beyond me, beyond the war, beyond everything. I closed them with my fingers. That was my last act for my friend. I sat there for I don't know how long, just numb, the battle still raging around me, until a lieutenant pulled me up and told me we had to move out. I left a piece of my soul in that French field with Mike. And after the shooting stopped, that was its own kind of agony. The silence was deafening. You'd look around at the survivors, the guys who made it, and their eyes, they had this hollow, thousand-yard stare. They'd seen too much, done too much. That was a wound I had no bandage for. No amount of sulfur powder or morphine could touch that kind of emptiness. You de-share a cigarette with a fella, and you wouldn't even talk. You just sit there, smoking, lost in the terrible movie playing behind your own eyes. People think the hardest part must be the blood, the gore, the sheer physical horror of it. And don't get me wrong, that was bad. The smell of burned flesh and open intestines is a smell you never get out of your nose. It's in there forever. But for me, the real burden, the thing that carved me out inside, was the compassion. It was the gratitude in that young German boy's eyes. It was the way a dying man would cling to your hand like you were the only solid thing in a world coming apart. How do you carry that? How do you accept that gratitude when you know, deep down, you failed? You didn't save him. You were just the last person he saw on this earth. That's the question that haunted my dreams for years, that still sneaks up on me sometimes in the quiet of the night. Did I do enough? Was there one more thing I could have tried? Could I have saved one more? That kid with the leg wound, Jimmy, he made it. I heard he got shipped back to England and eventually home. But what about the others? The ones I couldn't get to in time? The ones whose wounds were just too big? You carry them all. You carry a graveyard in your heart. When the war finally ended, when the shooting stopped for good, we got on the boats to go home. We scrubbed ourselves clean, put on fresh uniforms, and tried to look like the heroes everyone said we were. But my hands, they looked clean. I'd scrubbed the blood out from under my nails, the grime from my knuckles, but they never felt clean. Not really. They felt like they were still stained with it, or with Mike's last breath, with that German boy's tears, with the mud of 100 foxholes. I came home to parades and handshakes, and people saying, "Thank you for your service." And I'd smile and nod. But inside, I was just a medic, a guy with a bag of bandages who tried to patch up a broken world, one broken man at a time, and had to live with the awful, beautiful, crushing weight of caring for friend and foe alike. It's a weight I'll carry until the day I die. You always start with the same 3 words, you know. I am fine. You write it at the top of the page before you even say, "Dear Mum," or "Dearest Alina." It's like a ritual, a spell you cast to make it true for the 5 minutes it takes to scratch it out with a pencil that's always too short and never sharp enough. I am fine. It's the biggest lie I ever told, over and over again. I'd sit there on an ammo crate, or the edge of my foxhole, with the V-mail form balanced on my knee, and I'd try to build a wall of words between this nightmare and my home. How do you describe the sound a shell makes when it's coming right for you? Not the ones that go overhead with a whoosh, but the ones that scream like a freight train tearing the sky in half, the ones you know have your name on them. You don't. You write about the rain, or the funny-looking bread we got from the quartermaster, or how my buddy Jimmy managed to burn coffee again. You become an editor of your own life, cutting out the gore and the terror, leaving in just enough to prove you're still alive without scaring them half to death 3,000 miles away. There were feelings out here, things that would crawl up from your gut and sit in your throat that didn't have a name in any language I knew. How do you put that on paper for your mother to read over her morning tea? You learn to write between the lines. That's where the truth lived. I'd write a whole paragraph about the French sunrise, how the light came up over these fields and turned the mist to gold, how for a minute it was so peaceful you could almost forget. But I wouldn't write about the 2 dead cows in that same field, their bellies swollen up like balloons, or the sour-sweet smell that hung over everything, a smell you could taste in the back of your throat, a smell of rot and lime and things I don't like to think about even now. I'd mention the boys by name. "Tell Joe's mother I said hello," I'd write. Or, "Charlie says he hopes his girl hasn't run off with a 4F. It was a code." It was my way of making sure that if Charlie bought it the next day, if he stepped on a shoe mine or caught a sniper's bullet, Someone back home would know he was here, that he existed, that he was my friend. His name would be there, in ink, in a letter. That felt important, like a kind of insurance against being completely erased. Sometimes the truth would sneak out in ways you couldn't control, like my handwriting. If a shell landed close, real close, shaking the earth and filling your nose with the acrid bite of cordite, your hand would shake for an hour afterwards. You'd try to write, and the letters would be all jagged and spidery. I always wondered if my mum could see that tremor on the page, that little crack in the wall I was trying so hard to build. Then there were the letters I never sent. Those were the real ones. I remember one night, during a lull in some God-forsaken woods in the Hirchen forest, the cold so deep it felt like your bones were made of ice. The shelling had been bad all day, and the fear was just sitting in me, a cold, heavy stone. I started a letter to my father. My dad was a tough man, a veteran of the First War, and I wanted so badly to be strong for him. But that night, I just couldn't. I poured it all out onto the page. I wrote about how scared I was, how I didn't think I was brave enough, how the sound of the artillery made me want to curl up in a hole and never come out. I wrote about the boy from Ohio who'd been hit 2 days before, what was left of him. I filled 2 pages with a raw, trembling honesty that would have broken my mother's heart. When I was done, I just sat there looking at it. The paper seemed to pulse with all that fear. I couldn't send that. I couldn't put that burden on them. So I took my Zippo, the one with the map of New York I'd bought before I shipped out, and I lit the corner of the letter over a little petrol tin we used for a stove. I watched the words curl and blacken, my confession turning to ash and rising up into that dark German sky. It felt like a sacrifice, burning that truth, but it was better than sending it home. The other one I carried with me. A letter to my girl, Elena. We weren't engaged or anything, but we had an understanding. I wrote it after a particularly rough patrol, convinced I wasn't going to see the end of the week. It was everything I wanted to say to her, all the love and the hope and the promises for a future I couldn't really picture. I told her I loved her, that I thought about her every day, that I was coming back to her. I must have read that thing 100 times. I kept it folded up in the breast pocket of my field jacket, right over my heart. The paper got soft as cloth from being handled, the creases turned dark with dirt and sweat, the pencil smudging until some of the words were just grey ghosts. But I never sent it. It felt like a jinx, you know. Like if I sent it, it would become my last letter, my final words. So I kept it on me, a secret charm, a piece of her that was just for me. It was my good luck piece, more than any rabbit's foot. As long as that letter was in my pocket unsent, I felt like I still had a chance. Then there were the angry letters, the ones you scribble when you're so tired and filthy and sick of it all that you think you're going to scream. You'd write about the brass living in chateaux miles behind the line, about the stupid orders, about the sheer, dumb luck of who lives and who dies. You'd fill a page with words so bitter they taste like metal in your mouth. And then, just like the fearful one, you'd tear it up or burn it. You had to get the poison out, but you couldn't let it infect anyone else. When it was all over, when the shooting stopped and we finally got on a boat headed home, you'd think we'd have talked about it. But we didn't, not really. The loudest things were the things we never said. The silence we carried home was heavier than our duffel bags. We'd sit in a bar with guys from the old unit, and we'd talk about the funny times, the time Smitty tried to cook a chicken he'd liberated and set his tent on fire. We'd talk about the food, the weather, the towns we passed through. But we never talked about the fear. We never talked about the faces of the dead, or the way a man sounds when he's crying for his mother. There was an understanding, an unspoken agreement that those things stayed with us. And I think now, all these years later, that the truest record of my war wasn't in the letters that made it home, the cheerful, sanitized versions. It was in the ones that never got sent. The one I burned in a petrol tin, full of fear. The one I wore soft in my pocket, full of love. The ones I scribbled and destroyed, full of rage. Those were the real stories. We left them behind in the ashes of a campfire, or buried in the mud of a French field, or scattered to the wind. We thought that by not sending the pain, we could leave it there. But you don't. It comes home with you, a silent companion. You learn to live with it, to build a life around that quiet space. But sometimes, like now, when I smell rain on a cold morning, or hear a train whistle in the distance, I can still feel the weight of that unsent letter in my pocket, and I remember the boy who wrote it, hoping against hope that he'd live long enough to tell his story himself. You get to a point where you can't even feel scared anymore, not really. It's like the fear is a ration that's been stretched too thin, spread over too many days, too many patrols. You just feel hollow. Like an old ammo crate, empty inside, just waiting to be thrown on the scrap pile. That's how it was for me towards the end. They kept sending us replacements, kids mostly, their faces still soft, their eyes wide with a terror they hadn't learned to hide yet. They'd show up, fresh from the boat, smelling of wool and clean sweat, and we'd look at them not as new buddies, but as a kind of morbid clerk. You'd size a fella up, without even meaning to. You'd see the way his hands shook when he lit a cigarette, or the high pitch in his voice when he tried to joke around, and you'd just know. You'd think, this one's got 2 weeks, maybe 3, if the weather holds. It was a cold, ugly calculation, but it was the only kind of math that made sense out there. And when one of them didn't make it, when you'd hear the crack of a sniper's rifle or the crump of a mortar and later somebody'd say, "That new kid, what was his name? Jenkins." Yeah, Jenkins bought it. There was nothing. No grief, no anger. Just a sort of dull thud inside, like a stone dropping into mud. You'd feel guilty about that later, but in the moment, it was just another piece of the landscape. The noise, guard the noise. At first, it's all you can hear. The artillery miles away sounds like a giant tearing the sky in half. The machine gun fire, that's like a terrible, fast zipper. But after a while, it just becomes background. Like the traffic back home, or the train whistles. You'd be trying to heat a tin of stew over a little hexamine tablet, and the world would be exploding 100 yards away, and you'd just be focused on not burning the damn thing. I remember one time, early on, we'd taken a farmhouse, or what was left of one. There was a German soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, lying right there in the corner of the room we were using. He'd been dead a day or two. And I was so tired, so bone-achingly tired from digging in and moving and not sleeping, that I just sat down with my back against the wall, right next to him, and ate my rations. I wasn't being brave or tough. I was just too exhausted to care, too tired to even find another spot. The smell was, well, you never forget that smell. It gets in your clothes, your hair, the back of your throat. It's a sweet, rotten smell that clings to everything. But you just eat your corned beef hash, and you try not to look at his boots, because the boots are always the last thing to go. That's when you know you're changing. It's the little things that go first. I'd lie awake in my foxhole, trying to picture my mother's face. I could remember her hands, the way they felt on my forehead when I was sick, or the sound of her voice singing in the kitchen. But her face, it was like a photograph left out in the rain. The details had blurred and run together. I'd squeeze my eyes shut, trying to see the curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled, but it was just a ghost. That scared me more than any German tank. That was the war stealing something from me that wasn't its to take. So you make your own rules, your own little religions to get through the day. We all had superstitions. You always put your left boot on first. You never lit 3 cigarettes from the same match. You had a lucky sock, or a rabbit's foot, or you touched the helmet of the guy next to you before you went over the top. It was nonsense, of course, but it felt like the only thing you could control in a world that had gone completely mad. And the names, we stopped using real names. It was always Smitty or Tex or Junior. My name's Robert, but for 2 years I was Ace. Not because I was any good at cards, just because it was easier. When a Smitty buys it, it's a shame. When a Robert dies, it's a tragedy. It's a piece of a real person with a family and a life back home, and you can't afford to think about that. You just can't. So you make jokes. Dark, hollow jokes that would make a civilian sick to their stomach. You'd laugh, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was a bark, a release of pressure, like steam from a radiator. You'd see a guy get his helmet shot off, and you'd say, "Hey, Joe, they almost gave you a part there." You'd all laugh, this ragged, empty laugh, because if you didn't laugh, you'd start screaming and you'd never stop. It was all just a way to keep the machine running, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to keep your finger on the trigger without thinking about what was on the other end of your sights. You became a thing, an instrument of survival, and the person you used to be was just a story you told yourself to try and remember what warmth felt like. And then something happens, something small. Something so simple it cuts through all the grime and the numbness like a hot knife. For me, it was near the end, after we'd pushed into Germany. We were guarding a temporary holding pen for prisoners, just a muddy field with some wire around it. They were a sorry lot, these Russians. They'd been pressed into service by the Germans, Ostrapen they called them, and they'd been captured by us. They were skeletons in ragged uniforms, hollow-eyed and shuffling. We didn't have much for them, just some hardtack and what water we could spare. I was walking the perimeter, my boots sinking into the cold mud, the smell of wet wool and unwashed men thick in the air. I stopped to light a cigarette, cupping my hands against the damp breeze. And I saw one of them, an older guy, his face lined with dirt and exhaustion, looking at me. He wasn't begging, not like the others who'd hold out their hands. He was just looking. And then, slowly, he reached into the pocket of his tattered coat. He pulled out a piece of black bread, the end of a loaf, hard as a rock. It was probably all the food he had. He looked at it, then he looked at me, this German guard standing watch over him, and he broke the piece of bread in two. With a hand that was shaking from cold or hunger or both, he pushed the piece through the wire, offering it to me. Me, the enemy, the guy with the full belly and the warm coat. I just stood there, my cigarette forgot, the smoke curling up into the grey sky. I looked at that piece of bread in his grimy hand. I looked at his eyes. And in that moment, I didn't see a prisoner or a soldier or a Russian or a German. I saw a man who was starving, who had nothing, offering the last thing he owned to another man. It was the most human thing I had seen in 3 years. It was like a splash of cold water on my face. It woke something up in me that I thought had been buried forever under the mud and the blood and the noise. It was like a gear that had been frozen solid for years suddenly started turning again. I felt something crack open inside my chest, and for the first time in I don't know how long I felt, feeling. It wasn't anger or fear or numbness. It was a terrible, aching sadness for all of it. For him, for me, for all the boys who never made it home, for the world that had somehow come to this. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. I pushed my own cigarette through the wire to him instead. He nodded, just once, a slow, understanding nod, and took it. We didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. But in that silent exchange, that tiny act of grace in the middle of all that hell, I remembered. I remembered what it was to be human. Not a soldier, not a killer, not a machine. A man. And I knew then that surviving this war wasn't just about making it back home in one piece. It was about making sure you brought the piece of you that was still human back with you. That's the real fight. That's the war that never really ends.